politics. Just had Senator Leah Raptakis in. Now I have a familiar face, Representative Aaron Regunberg, candidate for Lieutenant Governor. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Kate.
A lot going on. New Year's upon us, back in session. Everything's going full tilt. But let's start off with one of the issues that you've been in before that we saw some traction on this week. National Grid not getting the rate increase that they had been hoping for.
Yeah, I think it's certainly good news that that National Grid is going to be getting at least a smaller rate increase than what they originally asked for. So it's great that has moved forward. You know, Maura Healey in Massachusetts, the Attorney General, sort of began that call, and it was great to see folks in Rhode Island take it on. We're still talking about a $45 million increase for ratepayers going to National Grid. And so for me, you know, it still gets to the fundamental problem. We've got this multinational corporation whose fundamental accountability is to shareholders and a CEO thousands of miles away. I am going to be introducing in the next couple of weeks the legislation that we spoke about before around beginning that process to open up public power utilities to create a system where we actually have some community accountability directly parallel to the folks on the ground who are most impacted by service and rate decisions, so that people can actually have a voice in those decisions.
And speaking of legislation that you're going to be reintroducing coming up, again, single-payer legislation. Where do we stand in 2018? How is this year any different than years past?
So January 24th, I'm looking forward. We'll be introducing our legislation to create a state-level single-payer system, sort of Medicare for all style healthcare system. And for me, you know, this is a personal issue. It gets really deep down. Healthcare should be a fundamental human right, not a privilege for those who can afford it. And we've made some really important strides under the ACA. We need to continue to work to defend those. But at the same time, we still have over 40,000 Rhode Islanders who are not covered. We need to be continuing to work towards universal coverage. And we still have a system that, it's not a rational, efficient system. Over a third of every healthcare dollar that's spent right now goes to administration, goes to advertising, goes to billing, to say nothing of corporate profits. So that's why we still have folks who are uninsured, and we still have a lot of people who are underinsured who are paying too much for too little care. And so what we're saying is, let's take a page out of every other developed country that has a single payer system. When you look across the world, America has higher healthcare costs by significant factors and worse health outcomes. I think it's because we've got this profit-based healthcare system, and there's a lot of efficiencies that we can get out of transitioning to a single-payer system. So again, we're going to continue to push. We're going to continue to push for universal access, for universal coverage for primary care particularly, and for creating a foundation so we can have a more rational delivery model for healthcare in this state. Obviously, you're going up against the private health insurance lobby.
The appetite up there's a lot of money involved in this.
Absolutely. There's some powerful players, some powerful, well-connected lobbyists. But again, as I've spoken with you before, we need a state house that is working for all Rhode Islanders, for folks who can't afford a well-connected corporate lobbyist. And so we're going to continue to push this legislation. We're going to continue to take on the fights. They're not going to be easy. There's some uphill fights. But we need to keep pushing.
Talking about a fight that you're looking to take on is to address the high cost of prescription drugs. Now, the legislation that you've put forth specifically is an interesting approach. You want information from the drug makers as to the actual costs that go into making the drugs. Have any states had success in sort of pulling this information, and why is it so important? And is it even feasible to think that this could happen?
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I'm really excited about this legislation. And just to take a step back, this is an issue. You know, I've heard about it from my constituents in my district, the monstrous cost of prescription drugs and how it edges out other things in folks' budget. And as I've been starting to travel around the state more and more this year, you know, I'm amazed by how consistently across every community in town, this is a huge struggle for Rhode Islanders. I mean, people are dealing with costs that continue to go up every year for prescription drugs, which puts them in a situation where they're making these incredibly painful decisions. Do I get my prescription filled? Do I put food on the table? Do I make my bills? You know, I talk to seniors who are in a position where they're taking their pills once every other day or every 3 days. It's a moral outrage. We should be outraged by this. And a big part of the reason, and there's a lot of research showing this, prescription drugs, the basic rules of supply and demand don't really work in this system because the prescription drug companies, there's no transparency over the way that their costs and prices work. There's a recent study by the AARP showing that, pharmaceutical companies, they are going to have the maximum possible cost that they think the market can possibly bear, and public interest has no role to play in those decisions. We think that public interest should be a factor in that, and so I'm putting in introduced last week legislation to, number one, require some transparency so that pharmaceutical companies have to show where those prices come from. If there's particular reasons why things need to go up, let's see it. And then it also creates a mechanism so that the state can have a maximum allowable price. Now, we're not talking about having unfair things. Not corporations can make a profit, but at the same time, we've seen all of these situations where prices are going up. I mean, there's some of the extremes, like the pharma bro who bought a patent for a prescription
Is he
drug.
in jail right now?
He's in jail right now, but it increased it by a factor of 56 times, from $13 per pill to $750. So we see those extremes, but even outside the context of those extremes, we see companies that are going to charge as much as they possibly can without factoring in the real life impacts on Rhode Islanders, on our parents, our grandparents, our children, and we think the state has a role to play to say, no, we need to protect consumers.
So I wanted you to come in here to talk on these pieces of legislation that you're supporting and putting forth. But of course, the big item right now, we just saw the Paw Sox move through Senate Finance. Senate's going to be taking it up next week. The Speaker has indicated he'd like to see it on the ballot. Your feelings on the matter, should it go to the voters?
Yeah, we've talked about this before, and I think that this is one of those issues where letting the people decide. I mean, that's the whole sort of message that I've had as a representative and with this campaign. We need to make sure that Rhode Islanders have a voice in their government. I generally think that that means that voter referendum is a pretty good system. And so to me, this is an issue that makes a lot of sense. It's an issue that I think a lot of people are conflicted over. You hear folks talking about, we value the Paw Sox, the impact in our communities, we don't want them to leave. And at the same time, we've got all of these critical public service needs. We've got schools that are physically falling apart around kids' heads. Is this the best use of those resources, particularly considering that it's a team owned by a number of millionaires and billionaires? Folks should have a say in whether their taxpayer dollars are going to go into that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
And finally, let's talk about the budget. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about what the deficit looks like this year, not just this year, but next year. There's talk about how the state's going to be able to tackle this. And talk about from your vantage point. I mean, there are issues that might have a price tag associated with them. If you're looking to increase minimum wage, look at things of the nature of spending. How can the state rectify being able to support programs that you're supportive and other folks are up there, and cutting costs where they're needed? How is the state going to be able to balance this?
Well, for me, I mean, first and foremost, we need to protect our most vulnerable. I'm interested to see the governor's budget coming out next week. We've heard already some comments about Medicaid cuts. I get very, very concerned about that. I mean, that's a program that, it's working. Medicaid, you got to talk about efficiencies when systems aren't working. Medicaid, it's a big cost outlay, but it's a system that's working. Folks are in nursing homes. They're getting the care that they need. So for me, the first approach with the budget is we need to make sure that we're not balancing it on the backs of folks who are vulnerable, who are going to be most impacted. We just saw the Trump administration and the Republican Congress pass a tax bill that is overwhelmingly geared to giving a huge cut to folks at the very, very top, the 1%. Meanwhile, at the state level, we've cut taxes on the wealthiest Rhode Islanders multiple times. I'm going to be introducing a millionaire's tax this year that folks are still going to be coming out hugely on top. We can factor in the GOP tax bill with their federal taxes. But I think that before we're talking about cutting Medicaid for seniors in nursing homes, we should be saying that the folks who are getting this immense windfall who already are seeing the largest gains from our economy, from income going to the top, that they need to pay their fair share.
So a lot of difficult decisions to be made up at the State House, but wanted to bring you in again. Balancing being a rep and running for lieutenant governor, how's that going so far?
It's been a crazy fun whirlwind. Absolutely, I was a little late here, so obviously there's a lot to do. But as I've said, the opportunity to travel all around Rhode Island, to see folks in every city and town, to experience the wonderful spectrum of everything Rhode Island has to offer. I mean, it's something I've known, but there's nothing quite like every single night going out to a different city and town and talking to folks that you might not have met. So I'm having a blast, and certainly I get more and more optimistic every day with all of the potential that we have in Rhode Island. This is such a wonderful state. We have so much, and I hear it all the time from folks. We just need to be able to reach that potential. We're always getting in the way of ourselves, stumbling over our own feet. Let's make sure we have a government that is speaking up for everyday Rhode Islanders, for folks who can't afford that well-connected corporate lobbyist, so that we can reach the potential that we have in this wonderful place.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come in. I know how busy you are, but it's going to be a busy week up at the State House next week. I'm sure I will see you up there. But I appreciate your taking the time, as always, to come here in studio.
Thanks for having me,
Representative
Kate.
Aaron
Great to see
Regunberg,
you.
Lieutenant Governor candidate. I'm going to let you go around the corner. I'm
Thanks
sure
a
you've got
lot.
places to go.
See you later.
That just about wraps up another week here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. It's been a good one. We hope everyone is doing well. It is melting quite a bit out there. So if you're on the roads, planning on getting on the roads, give yourself some time. Be careful. It's going to be kind of a wet weekend with some potential for freezing. So stay tuned for GoLocal for some weather updates. And of course, more as well on GoLocalProv.com. We'll be back on Monday. It's MLK Day. We will be here in studio. So whether you're working, whether you're taking the day off in remembrance, we're going to be here with a lineup for you with Molly O'Brien at 3 o'clock, Josh Fenton at 4. So as always, we appreciate your tuning in to Go Local Live. We appreciate your feedback and wishing everyone a healthy weekend ahead. We'll see you next week. I'm Go Local News Editor Kate Nagle.